Somewhere in a museum in Oxford, there is a small clay prism about the size of your fist. You could hold it in one hand, it fits in a coat pocket, and written into its surface, in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay nearly 4,000 years ago, is a list of kings, a list of cities, a list of who ruled where and for how long. On the surface, that doesn't sound remarkable. Plenty of ancient civilizations kept records like that. What makes this one different is the numbers. The first king on the list, a man named Alulim, recorded as having ruled for 28,800 years. The next king, Alulgar, ruled for 36,000 years. Keeps going. King after king, dynasty after dynasty, each one sitting on the throne for tens of thousands of years. The total, just for the kings listed before a single catastrophic flood, adds up to over 240,000 years of continuous royal rule. And nobody in nearly a century of serious scholarly work has fully agreed on what those numbers actually mean. That's the puzzle sitting at the centre of this episode. Not a mystery invented by the internet, not a conspiracy, not ancient aliens. A real physical artifact that trained historians and mathematicians and archaeologists have been arguing about since it was first translated in the early 20th century and still haven't settled. The numbers are real, the disagreement is real, and the fact that no clean explanation has stuck after all this time is, honestly, the most interesting thing about it. The artifact is called the Weld-Blundell Prism, catalogued as WB 444, and it contains one of the most complete surviving copies of what scholars call the Sumerian King List. It was purchased in Iraq sometime around 1922 and donated to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where it still sits. The prism has 4 sides, each covered in cuneiform text, and it rotates on a central spindle, which means whoever made it intended it to be read, turned, read again. It wasn't a storage document buried in an archive. It was an object meant to be handled and consulted, and someone cared enough about this list to commission a version that could be used. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. Weld-Blundell Prism isn't the only copy of the King List. There are over 20 fragmentary versions that have been found across different sites in ancient Mesopotamia, copied over centuries, sometimes agreeing with each other, sometimes diverging in ways that raise more questions than they answer. The list was clearly important to the people who kept copying it. Important for what reason? Political legitimacy? Religious tradition? A genuine attempt at historical record-keeping? Some combination of all three? That question too doesn't have a settled answer, and that's actually what makes it worth sitting with for a while. Here's what we can say with reasonable confidence going into this. The Sumerian King List was a real document produced by real scribes working in ancient Mesopotamia, probably assembled in something close to its current form sometime around 2100 to 1900 BCE. Traditions it records are almost certainly older. It lists kings and dynasties in sequence, assigns each ruler a specific reign length, and organises all of it around a single dramatic event, a great flood that divided history into a before and an after. Before the flood, kings ruled for impossibly long stretches of time. After the flood, the reign lengths drop sharply and keep dropping until they look almost ordinary. That transition from the mythological to the recognisably human is one of the genuinely strange features of the document, and explaining it is something scholars are still working through. More. What we cannot say with confidence, and what this episode is going to be careful about, is why the antediluvian numbers are so large. There are serious mainstream proposals on the table, ideas involving ancient mathematical systems, symbolic numerology, political propaganda, compressed mythological time. Those explanations are compelling. Some of them are partial. None of them has definitively closed the debate. And alongside the mainstream proposals, there are speculative readings that get a lot of attention online, readings that reach toward much stranger conclusions. We'll look at those too, but clearly, because the difference between what evidence supports and what imagination produces is worth keeping track of. If you're listening to this late at night, or you've got it on while you're drifting off, good. That's exactly the kind of listening this is built for. A historical puzzle that goes somewhere real. A question that doesn't have a neat bow on it, something to turn over in your mind while the day settles down. There's no jump scare at the end. There's no moment where someone tells you the ancient Sumerians were secretly visited by extraterrestrials. What there is a genuinely unresolved question about a very old piece of clay, and the slow, careful work of figuring out how close we can get to an answer. Before we go further, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I read these for Host, and it's always interesting in the way the original puzzle is interesting. People tuning in from Osaka at 2 a.m, from Toronto at 11, from somewhere in the Netherlands before the sun comes up. There's something fitting about sitting with a 4,000-year-old document in the quiet part of the day. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I genuinely look at them, and if you want to listen without ads and without background music, completely clean audio, the Spotify version of this channel has all of that. No interruptions, nothing layered underneath the voice. If that sounds like what you're looking for, there's a link in the description to follow on Spotify. And to support the channel directly, keep these episodes going and keeps them free of the stuff that makes nighttime listening harder than it needs to be. Now, back to the prism, back to the numbers that refuse to behave. The reason the Sumerian King List has stayed interesting to historians for as long as it has isn't just the extreme reign lengths, though those are striking enough on their own. It's the combination of things happening in a single document at the same time. You have genuine historical figures in the later sections of the list, kings who show up in other ancient records, whose cities have been excavated, whose reigns can be cross-referenced with archaeology. Then you have, in the earlier sections, kings with reigns of 28,000 years living in cities that may or may not have existed, separated from the historical record by a flood of uncertain status. The mythological and the historical are sitting right next to each other in the same document, treated with the same scribal seriousness, the same careful notation. That's not an accident. That's a choice someone made. And understanding why that choice was made is one of the central questions here. The numbers, in other words, are not a glitch. They're not a translation error. They're not a coincidence. They are, in some sense, the whole point. Whatever the scribes who compiled this list were doing, they put those numbers in deliberately. The question is what they meant by them, what tradition they were drawing on, what audience they were writing for, and what work those enormous figures were meant to do in the culture that produced them. That's what the next several sections are going to work through, piece by piece, as carefully as the evidence allows, starting with the artifact itself, and what it actually says when you read it, the way a scribe would have. So, what exactly is the Sumerian King List, beyond a document with numbers that don't behave? At its most basic level, it is a scribal composition. Someone, or more likely, a series of someones working within an established scribal tradition, assembled a record of Mesopotamian dynasties in sequence. Each entry follows a consistent format: a city name, a king's name, a reign length, then the next king, the next reign, until something interrupts the sequence: a conquest, a collapse, a shift of power, and the list announces the transfer with a phrase that became one of the most repeated formulas in the entire document. Kingship was carried to another city. Then it starts again. New city, new king, new reign length. The structure is almost mechanical in its regularity. And that regularity is itself meaningful because it reflects something deeper than record keeping. The concept sitting underneath the list is what scholars call the theology of kingship in ancient Mesopotamia, and it is a genuinely unusual idea once you sit with it. In Sumerian political thought, kingship was not just a human institution. It was a divine gift, something that descended from the heavens and was entrusted to humanity in a specific place for a specific period of time. The gods didn't give kingship to a person, they gave it to a city. And when that city's moment was over, its power waned, or its rulers failed, or the gods simply moved on, kingship was lifted from that city and carried somewhere else. Different city would receive it. A dynasty would hold it. But the thing being passed around, the legitimizing force of royal authority, always the same thing. It was singular, continuous, unbroken. This is not how most modern people think about political succession, and it is worth pausing on, because it shapes everything about how the King List works. The list is not presenting a history of competing powers, rival dynasties, overlapping spheres of influence. It is presenting a single continuous thread of legitimate authority moving through time, city by city, dynasty by dynasty. The fact that two kings may have ruled simultaneously in different cities doesn't matter within the document's logic. Only one city could hold kingship at any given moment. The others were simply waiting their turn, or had already had theirs. The list organizes the messy, contested reality of ancient Mesopotamian politics into something much cleaner. Single line, leading from the very beginning of civilization to the present moment of whoever was reading it. That is what the text is trying to do at its core. It is not a neutral archive. It is an argument about continuity. It takes the past, stretching all the way back to the first city, and the first king, after kingship descended from heaven, and draws it forward in an unbroken line to the political present. The dynasty currently in power isn't an interruption or an overthrow. It is the latest legitimate holder of something ancient and sacred. The King List is, among other things, document designed to make the present feel inevitable. This is where things get interesting, in terms of what the text actually is, versus how it reads on the page. Because when you sit with it, the Sumerian King List does two things simultaneously that are in some tension with each other. Parts of it feel like mythic memory. Kings with names that carry symbolic or divine resonance, ruling for spans of time that clearly don't belong to any human lifespan, living in the deep legendary past before a world-altering flood. Book. These sections feel like the tradition is reaching back into a layer of time that works differently, where the usual rules of human life don't apply, and where the numbers carry meaning of a different kind than a census record would. And then there are other sections that feel much more like political record, later dynasties in the list, contain rulers who appear in other ancient documents. Gilgamesh is in there, with a reign length still far too long to be literal but attached to a city. Uruk, that has been excavated and studied extensively. Enmebaragesi of Kish shows up in the king list, and his name also appears on ancient inscriptions found in the ground. Some kings in the later sections have reigns of 30 years, 60 years, figures that a human life could actually contain. The document shifts registers as it moves through time, and that shift is not incidental. Pot is one of the most significant structural features of the text. Because the king list is divided, not formally with a chapter heading or a break in the clay, but unmistakably by a flood. Everything before the flood belongs to one kind of time. Everything after the flood belongs to another. Before the flood, the antediluvian section, there are 8 kings in 5 cities. Some versions say 10 kings. The numbers vary slightly across the different surviving copies, which is itself worth noting. But in all of them, the reigns are enormous. Tens of thousands of years per ruler. Numbers that pile up into a total that dwarfs recorded human history by an order of magnitude. Then the flood sweeps over the land, in the document's own words, and afterward kingship descends again. New cities, new kings, but the reign lengths have collapsed. The first kings after the flood still rule for centuries in some cases, but not millennia, and as the list moves forward through time, the reigns keep shrinking, irregularly, with occasional outliers. The general direction is unmistakable. The document is moving toward the human scale. That structural break, flood as the dividing line between 2 modes of time, is one of the things that has generated the most discussion among scholars. Flood doesn't appear just in the Sumerian King List. It shows up across ancient Mesopotamian literature, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Atrahasis myth, in multiple cuneiform texts where a catastrophic deluge separates an earlier age from the present world. King List is participating in a much larger tradition of flood memory. Whether that memory reflects a real geological event, literary inheritance, or a cosmological structuring device that ancient Mesopotamians used to organize deep time into comprehensible phases, probably some combination of all 3, though the proportions are debated. What matters for understanding the King List as a document is that the flood is doing structural work. It is not decoration. It is the hinge, the antediluvian kings on one side, living in a time when the world was different, when divine forces were more directly present, when the spans of individual reigns could exceed what we would now consider geological epochs. The post-flood kings on the other side, living in a world closer to the one the scribes themselves inhabited, a world of recognizable human institutions and compressed human lifespans. The document is not confused about which side of that line it is on. It knows. It is using the flood to say, this is where that time ended, this time began. Why does all of this matter? Not just as an interesting artifact, but as a document that people kept copying for centuries across a large stretch of Mesopotamian history? The answer probably has several layers to it. King List served real political functions. When a new dynasty rose to power and wanted to establish legitimacy, having its city appear in the correct place in the King List, having kingship arrive at its doorstep in proper sequence, a way of anchoring that power in something older and larger than military victory. It connected the present ruler to a chain stretching back before the flood, back to the moment when kingship first descended from heaven. That is a powerful thing to claim. and the document was a vehicle for claiming it. But there is also something that goes beyond pure propaganda in the way the text is constructed. The scribes who compiled and copied the King List were clearly engaged in a genuine attempt to organize their understanding of the past. They were asking, how did we get here? What came before? Where does this present moment fit in the longer story? The King List is their answer, and it is a more sophisticated answer than it might appear. It acknowledges a deep past that works by different rules, marks a rupture. It traces a path through the rupture to the present, and it does all of this in a format precise enough to be consulted, copied, revised, and argued over. The tension between the mythic and the historical register is not a flaw in the document. It is the document. The scribes were not confused about whether Alulim's 28,800-year reign was the same kind of fact as a later king's 30-year reign. They were working in a tradition that understood deep time and present time as operating differently, and they built that understanding into the structure of the text. Whether the numbers in the antediluvian section encode a mathematical system, a symbolic theology, or a compressed memory of genuine dynasties stretched into legendary proportions, question that will take some working through. But the place to start is simply this. King List exists because continuity mattered deeply to the people who made it. And the numbers, however strange, part of how they expressed that continuity. What the prism itself looks like, and what the different surviving copies tell us about how the tradition evolved, is where we go next. If you were to encounter the Sumerian King List in the way most specialists do today, you would not meet it as a scroll, or a neat stack of pages, or even a single tablet. You would meet it as an oddly shaped chunk of baked clay in the British Museum. Catalogued as WB 444, it's about the size of your hand, maybe a little larger, and it isn't flat. It's a prism. Imagine a long four-sided bar of clay, like an elongated pyramid, with the top chopped off, each of the four faces carefully smoothed and then covered edge to edge in cuneiform signs. The scribe wrote the text in columns running down each face, then turned the prism a quarter turn, and kept going, rotating as he worked. To read it properly, you have to do the same thing. You don't sit in front of one surface. You turn the object slowly in your hands, letting the lines wrap around from face to face. That physical format is not random. It tells us something about how this text was supposed to function. A tablet has a front and a back, a natural beginning and end. A prism, especially one with its faces divided into neat, parallel columns, feels more like a reference object. You rotate, you consult, move back and forth. It is dense, continuous, and somewhat indifferent, to which point you choose as your entry. King List on WB 444 is presented as a block of authority, not a story with a narrative arc. The clay itself is a particular colour now, a sort of muted, time-worn brown, but it was once wet, soft, freshly impressed with stylus marks in an old Babylonian city more than 3,500 years ago. After the writing was finished, prism was dried and fired. At some point it broke. Today the top is missing and parts of the sides are damaged. Whole lines of text are gone. Others trail off into crumbling edges. Even this, the most famous copy of the King List, is a partial witness. And that word matters here. Copy. WB 444 is not the Sumerian King List. It is one instantiation of a text that clearly existed in many versions. Modern scholarship calls that a text tradition. Not a single canonical original, but a family of related manuscripts, each one reflecting a slightly different stage in the text's life. This is where the King List stops behaving like the unbroken line of Kingsit, describes, and starts acting like a living document. Because WB 444 is only one of more than a dozen substantial witnesses have. Fragments have turned up in places that were important Mesopotamian centres at different times. Nippur, Lhasa, Sippar, and elsewhere. Some came from controlled excavations dug out of temple precincts or city mounds in the early 20th century. Others entered museum collections through antiquities markets, purchased in bulk with little or no recorded find spot, precise archaeological context lost. One early tablet was found at Nippur by the University of Pennsylvania excavations, and now sits in Philadelphia. Others ended up in Istanbul's Museum of the Ancient Orient after Ottoman period digs. A particularly important fragment came from the site of Susa in modern Iran, carried off there in antiquity as booty from Mesopotamia and only rediscovered in the 19th century. WB 444 itself was acquired by the British Museum in the 19th century, probably as part of a lot of tablets shipped out of Iraq when European institutions were hungry for cuneiform of any kind. The result is a textual jigsaw puzzle scattered across multiple countries and collections. Each piece preserves some portion of the King List, but no two pieces are identical. They differ in small ways. A sign written slightly differently, a king's name spelled with an extra element, reign length that doesn't quite match. They also differ in larger ways. The inclusion or omission of entire dynasties, different totals for how long a city is said to have held kingship, occasionally even a different order of cities. This might sound chaotic. For philologists, it is exactly the sort of chaos that allows you to reconstruct how a text evolved. The irregularities are information. When one tablet has 8 antediluvian kings and another has 10, that isn't just an error, caught. It's evidence that the tradition itself was open to revision, augmentation, and reinterpretation. When a prism like WB 444 gives one number for a king's reign, and another manuscript from a different city gives a slightly different number, that discrepancy becomes a clue. Did a scribe miscopy? Did he deliberately adjust the figure to fit a numerical pattern? Did he have access to a slightly different textual ancestor? Material damage layers another level of difficulty over all this. Many of the surviving witnesses are broken in precisely the places we care about most. Antediluvian sections are missing lines. Flood markers are partially effaced. Reign totals at the end of dynasties would help us see how ancient scribes were adding these numbers together, have fallen away with the crumbled edges of the clay. Scholars talk about lacunae, gaps in the text where the clay is gone and only the empty space remains. To work with this, Assyriologists collate, take each surviving manuscript, line it up as far as possible with the others, and note every agreement and disagreement. Over time, painstaking comparison. You can build what is called a composite text, edited reconstruction, that tries to represent the underlying King List as it might have existed behind all these variant copies, where all the manuscripts agree the editor can be reasonably confident. Where they diverge, the composite shows alternatives, often with small marks and notes indicating which version appears on which tablet. This is not a mechanical process. It involves judgment, 3 manuscripts give one reign length and 2 give another, a modern editor might tentatively favour the majority reading. But sometimes the minority reading is mathematically more coherent with the Sunan surrounding numbers or better fits known historical data from other sources. The editor has to weigh probability, which reading looks more like a deliberate revision, which looks more original. King List, in other words, is no longer a single line of numbers. It is a mesh of scribal decisions spanning centuries. All of that bears directly on the question that drew us here, the enormous reign lengths before the flood. When people quote the King List as saying that Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, they are usually quoting that appears on WB 444. But not every witness agrees on every antediluvian reign length. Some copies shorten or lengthen particular kings. Others adjust the totals for how long kingship stayed in a particular city before the flood came. And in several crucial spots, the clay simply fails us. The numbers are gone. That means that any attempt to interpret these figures has to start from a position of uncertainty. We are dealing with a textual tradition in motion, not a fixed dataset. If a later scribe in an old Babylonian school decided that an earlier reign total needed to be fixed, so that the sum of the antediluvian kings came out to a neat, symbolically loaded number. When converted into base 60, he could change a sign or two. If another scribe thought a particular city ought to be represented in the deep past for local political reasons, he could insert a king, complete with an appropriately impressive reign. Over generations, these kinds of moves would ripple through the tradition. Presence of multiple copies also tells us something positive. This text mattered enough that scribes kept reproducing it, even when they did not agree on the details. It circulated across cities and centuries. It was taught, copied as an exercise, dated to reflect new political realities. In that process, the King List acquired layers, like a geological formation, early strata of mythic kings and impossible numbers, later layers of dynasties whose names overlap with contemporary inscriptions, marginal adjustments, corrections, that shift the numeric landscape in subtle ways. So when we look at the WB 444 prism today, turning it in our hands, tracing the columns of wedge-shaped signs that record those immense antediluvian reigns, we are not just reading a single scribe's work. We are seeing the surface of a long-running conversation inside Mesopotamian scribal culture about how to line up myth, memory, mathematics, political legitimacy. The damage, the missing lines, the variant readings across the different copies. All of those are part of that conversation. To understand what the numbers might be doing, we have to get inside the habits of the scribes who produced them. We have to learn, as much as we can, to read the King List like they did. Not as a modern historian scanning for literal years, but as someone trained in cuneiform mathematics, narrative formula, and political theology. That is where we go next. If you strip the King List down to its skeleton, a very simple pattern emerges: city, dynasty, king, reign, total, transfer, over and over again. It usually begins with a formula. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That first clause is important. Kingship is not just something humans decide to do. It arrives, almost like a divine substance, and it chooses a city. Then the list moves into the sequence for that city. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled X years. Alalgar ruled Y years. When the scribe has finished with the kings of that city, He adds up the numbers and seals them with a summary. 2 kings who ruled for years. Then comes the pivot. Then Eridu fell and kingship was taken to Bad Tibira. That phrase, kingship was taken to, is the backbone of the whole composition, turns a string of rulers into a story about a single, almost tangible thing, kingship, moving from place to place. Prism repeats this rhythm dozens of times. City lists of one or more kings, reign lengths, a brief total, then the announcement that kingship has been transferred. Sometimes the verb is taken, sometimes carried off. Sense is always that kingship is being relocated, not abolished. On the surface, that part is straightforward. A scribe. Learning the text would memorize the order of mites and the sequence of dynasties, the way a modern student might memorize the order of presidents or emperors. The place names and most of the royal names are unambiguous. They can be matched in later parts of the list. Kings, we know, from independent inscriptions, building dedications and year names. The skeleton of city. Dynasty. King is not especially mysterious. The trouble begins as soon as you lean in on the numbers and the categories. Even for a well-trained Assyriologist, cuneiform numerals require a double take. The same clusters of wedges can mean different things depending on context. Single units, tens, 60s, multiples of 60, or larger composite values. In the King List, those values are often written compactly. A few signs stand in for what, to our eyes, is an enormous number. The scribe wasn't trying to fool anyone. He was writing in the ordinary conventions of his own mathematical world. That mathematical world ran on base 60, not base 10. 60 was the organizing unit, the way 10 is in our decimal system. Time, measures, and accounts were all expressed as combinations of 60s. So, when the King List gives a reign as 28,800 years, is not one long string of digits. It is a neat pattern of 60s stacked together. Total for a dynasty is likewise expressed in sexagesimal chunks. And those chunks can be arranged to produce numbers that are mathematically satisfying in ways that jump out to a scribe and are invisible to us. That is where the list stops being simply enumerations, behaving like a piece of crafted literature. Mesopotamian scribes were taught to think in formulae, lists, proverbs, omen series, hymns, epics. They all rely on repeated structures. A king list is not just a neutral inventory of rulers. It is a genre with conventions. It opens with a cosmogonic gesture. After kingship descended from heaven, it organizes history into blocks defined by where kingship resides, closes dynastic units with a counting formula. It marks a cosmic break with the line about the flood. Those are literary moves as much as archival ones. In that sense, the King List sits somewhere between two worlds. On the one hand, looks like an archival document, the sequence of legitimate rulers stretching back into the remotest past. On the other hand, it behaves like a curated story that uses historical material, but reshapes it to convey ideas about order, divine favour, proper transmission of power. One way to see this is to compare it with other lists from the same culture. Scribal schools preserved lists of cities, gods, professions, plants, stones, and signs. Those lists are clearly didactic. They teach vocabulary, categories, and hierarchies. They are not archives in the modern sense. They are tools for thinking. Yet, they are also anchored in the real world, the cities, plants, and professions. They name are things a student would recognize. The King List works similarly, takes known kings and known cities and arranges them in a pattern that teaches a vision of history. Kingship moves. cities rise and fall. Flood divides time into before and after. Some rulers get long mythic reigns, others get much more plausible spans. When you read it as a scribe, you are not just picking up information. You are absorbing a template for how royal time ought to look. It is where the straightforward bits and the tricky bits intersect. Names and city sequences, especially in the post-diluvian sections, can often be checked. We have inscriptions from kings of Ur, Izin, Larsa, and so on, who also appear in the King List, that gives the list a grounding in what we would call history. But the reign lengths, the totals for how long a dynasty held kingship, and sometimes the very categories used to group kings, that is where things start slipping into another register. For example, some dynasties are clearly local. The kings of Ur, the kings of Kish. Others are more conceptual, like the kings, who were kings and not sons of kings, or groupings that fold together rulers from different cities under one heading, from a scribal perspective. These are not errors, they are signals about legitimacy and status. The same is true of the flood line. Text does not just say, "There was a flood." It says, "The flood swept over," and then, after the flood had swept over, kingship was taken down again from heaven. The categories shift. Before the flood, you have antediluvian kings in cities that may already have felt legendary. After, you get dynasties that blend mythic aura with more ordinary royal chronicle. Within each of these zones, the numbers behave differently. Before the flood, reigns are enormous. After, they rapidly contract to human scale. But internally, within each zone, there are patterns. Totals for a city may add up neatly in sexagesimal terms. The sum of all antediluvian reigns in a given version may form a round, symbolically resonant figure. Those internal symmetries are unlikely to be accidental. They look like the fingerprints of scribal calculation. To someone trained in that tradition, internal coherence would not mean every number is literally true in calendar years. It would mean the reign lengths and totals form a harmonious structure that fits our expectations for how divine and royal time should be ordered. If that required adjusting a reign by a unit or two of 60 to produce a better sum at the end of a dynasty, Scribe could do that, and still feel he was preserving the truth of the tradition. This helps explain how the King List could function for centuries as both an authoritative text and a flexible one. It could be copied in scribal schools as a model of proper writing and calculation, could be cited by kings who wanted to situate themselves in a long, venerable line. The descent of kingship, the order of cities, the flood as a dividing line, remained stable enough that different versions still felt like the same composition, the same time. Individual numbers, totals, and even dynastic groupings could be tuned to fit local politics, pedagogical needs, or evolving numerical tastes. Reading it like a scribe then involves holding two things in your mind at once. On one side, there is the archive-like surface, a chronological list of rulers, cities, and durations. On the other, there is the literary architecture, formulas, the transfers of kingship, the symbolic handling of time. The gigantic antediluvian reigns sit right at the junction of those two. They look like years, they behave like numbers that can be added and totaled, but they also participate in a pattern that is more about meaning than about measurement. That is why the list can be internally coherent, even when the reign lengths strain credulity for us. The coherence lives in the patterning, in the way cities alternate, in how the flood punctuates the line in how the sexagesimal totals resolve into elegant sums. To see that clearly, we have to move next into the part of the text that pushes this tension to its limits. The kings who ruled before the flood for tens of thousands of years, in a world that already feels like myth when you finally reach the beginning of the story on WB 444. You don't start with something modest. You drop straight into a world where a handful of kings rule for spans of time so large that, even written in neat sexagesimal clusters, feel like they don't quite belong on the same page as ordinary human life. The antediluvian section is short. That in itself is striking. For the entire epoch before the flood, the prism gives you only 8 kings and 5 cities. That's it. Eridu, Badtibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, tiny cast list holding up an unimaginable amount of time. The rhythm here is the same as in the rest of the text, cranked up to an almost absurd scale. Alulim became king. He ruled 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled 36,000 years. 2 kings. They ruled 64,800 years. Then Eridu fell, and kingship was taken to Badtibera. Already, the numbers are doing something odd. 64,800 years in a single city, with only 2 names. You get 3 kings in Badtibera, with reigns of 43,200, 28,800, and 36,000 years. Then, the same closing formula. The count of kings, the enormous total, the movement of kingship onto the next place. It keeps going in the beat. In Larak, Ensipasiana ruled 28,800 years. 1 king. Larak, 28,800 years. Then Larak fell and kingship was taken to Sippar. In Sippar, Enmendarana became king. He ruled 21,000 years. 1 king. Sippar, 21,000 years. Then Sippar fell and kingship was taken to Shuruppak. Shuruppak gets the last group. Several kings, the most famous of whom, in later tradition, is Ubara Tutu, the father of the flood hero Ziusudra. Their reigns are shorter by antediluvian standards, still thousands of years each, but the cumulative total remains gigantic. Then the hammer falls. 5 cities, 8 kings. They ruled 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. In just a few lines, text. The text has carried you from the descent of kingship to the annihilating boundary of the flood on the shoulders of a tiny number of impossibly long-lived rulers. It's easy to get lost, but the pacing matters. List is not trying to overwhelm you with an endless genealogy. It almost does the opposite. It compresses the entire pre-flood world into a minimalist sequence of names. Alulim, Alalgar, the shepherd kings of Badtibera, Parsiana in Larak, and Mendorana in Sippar, the final Shuruppak rulers. Each name carries weight in other texts, especially in later Sumerian and Akkadian literature, but here they appear as beats in a pattern. King, absurdly large number, total, transfer. For a modern reader, the instinct is to reach for a calculator. 200 years before the flood even happens. If you compare that to archaeological chronologies, it makes no sense at all. City sites like Eridu and Shuruppak have occupational histories measured in millennia, not hundreds of thousands of years. No human lifespan we know of comes remotely close to even the smallest of these reigns. That shock, the sense that these numbers have broken loose from any biological or historical reality, is one of the main reasons the King List is so famous online. It feels like either a cosmic typo or a revelation. Either scribes have somehow miscopied years for months or days, or the text is quietly hinting at some forgotten age, when kings, gods, or something in between, really did live for tens of thousands of years. But if you back up into the scribal world that produced WBB 444, the antediluvian section looks a little different. First, the structure. 8 kings across 5 cities, with a clean total of 241,200 years. That total is not random. Sexagesimal terms. It resolves into a pattern of 60s that would be tidy to a trained eye. Individual reigns: 28,000, 800, 36,000, 43,000, 200 are themselves neat multiples of 60 and 3,600. The numbers interlock. They are chosen to sum cleanly, to create a harmonious block of before the flood time. Second, the names themselves are not neutral placeholders. Alulim and Alalgar reappear in later incantations and scholarly lists. Enmendurana becomes a figure associated with divine wisdom and heavenly journeys, a kind of precursor to the biblical Enoch in later comparative readings. Baratutu and his son Zeusudra belong squarely in the flood mythology of Mesopotamia. These kings are not filed here because some archive happened to preserve their civil registers. They are here because, for the tradition, they are the right anchors for the pre-flood world. In other words, the antediluvian section is already operating in a mythic register, even while it uses all the trappings of a chronicle. Years, totals, city sequences. The same kingship was taken too. Formula as the later, more historical parts. It looks like a list, but it behaves like a cosmogonic prologue. The flood line makes that explicit. Then the flood swept over. That phrase is not just a dating marker, it is a boundary between worlds. Mesopotamian literature is full of floods, the Sumerian flood story, in which the gods decide to wipe out humanity, and a single man, Zeusudra, survives in a boat, the later Akkadian Atrahasis epic. The flood episode embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, told by the immortal Utnapishtim. These are not eyewitness reports of a single event. They are traditions that use a catastrophic flood as a way to talk about the reset of human history, the limits of mortality, and the fragility of divine favour. The King List's flood is part of that family. It does not narrate the disaster. It only marks its effects on kingship. Before, kingship descends once, settles into a small circuit of cities, lingers for hundreds of thousands of years. After, kingship descends again, and everything changes. Reign lengths contract dramatically, dynasties proliferate, and the texture of history starts to look more like what we can check against other records. So how are listeners supposed to take those antediluvian numbers? There is no single answer we can point to. Ancient Mesopotamians did not leave us a commentary saying, "By the way, don't worry, this is just symbolic. We can make some cautious inferences." The first is that year was not a purely biological measure in this context. A year is a counted unit, place in a numerical system. To a scribe, the fact that you can add reigns and totals, and that they produce elegant sums in base 60, is a sign of correctness. Literal lifespans are not the only, or even the main, concern. Kingship, in the antediluvian age, is being measured in divine or cosmic units, not in the same kind of years that you would use to reckon a barley loan. The second is that Mesopotamian audiences were already used to long lifespans in mythic material. Gods, semi-divine heroes, primordial rulers routinely stretch the limits of ordinary mortality. If you can have a hero who can travel to the ends of the world or wrestle with death itself, king who reigns for 36,000 years in the age, before the flood may not strike you as mathematically absurd. It may strike you as appropriate. Of course, the first kings, living closer to the gods and to the origins of order, would have reigns that outstrip anything seen later. At the same time, the scribes are not just stacking arbitrary big numbers for effect, calibrating them. Different manuscripts of the King List preserve slightly different totals for the antediluvian section, but in each case the reigns resolve into coherent sexagesimal patterns. That suggests an interest in numerical design as much as in narrative grandeur. This brings to the core question that keeps it coming back whenever the King List is discussed. How are we supposed to read these reigns, literally as straightforward calendar years, implying either that the text preserves some forgotten reality of pre-flood hyper-longevity, or that the scribes simply did not realize how implausible the figures were? Symbolically, deliberate exaggerations that express the qualitative difference of the primordial age with the specific values chosen for their mathematical beauty rather than their empirical accuracy. Or as something in between, numbers that began in some older, perhaps non-year-based system of reckoning, month, seasons, ritual cycles, and were later reinterpreted as years, without entirely losing their original structure. Mainstream scholarship tends to cluster around the last two options. Most Assyriologists see the antediluvian reigns as operating in a mythic or schematic mode, not as data points on a usable historical timeline. The fact that the same cities and names appear in other mythological texts reinforces that reading. But the exact mechanism, whether they encode older counting systems or deliberate numerological games, or some mixture, is still debated. What we can say with some confidence is that the flood line is doing double duty. It divides mythic, scale time from the more human, scaled dynasties that follow, and it ties the King List into a much wider Mesopotamian habit of imagining a before and an after centered on a world-destroying flood. To understand how the numbers behave on the far side of that boundary, and why they suddenly start looking more like plausible lifetimes, we have to follow kingship down again, into the post-diluvian world, where reigns shrink, cities multiply, and the King List starts to overlap with the archaeological record. That is where the contrast between divine and human time becomes impossible to ignore. When the text picks up again after the flood, it uses almost the same phrase it used at the very beginning. After the flood had swept over, when kingship had descended again from heaven. The key word there is again. Kingship descends twice in this document. Once into the strange, stretched out, age of 8 kings and hundreds of thousands of years, and once into something that starts to look a lot more like the world we recognize. Immediately, instead of reigns of 28,800 or 43,200 years, you start seeing figures that, while still long by modern standards, sit comfortably in the realm of legendary but conceivable lives. 100 years, 120, 300. In some manuscripts, a few rulers still push into the 600 or 700 range. The absurdity has gone out of the numbers. They no longer blow up the scale of human time. Dynasties begin to accumulate more names. A city might now host 10 or 12 kings before. It fell and kingship was taken to the next centre. Totals are still given. How many kings? How many years? But those totals are now measured in the tens of centuries rather than in geological spans. Political turnover becomes faster, the circuit of cities expands. In literary terms, this reads like a hard cut. Before the flood, a terse prologue, a handful of giant rains, the sense of an elongated, almost static cosmos, where very little changes at the human level over unimaginable stretches of time. After the flood, ocean, succession disputes, shorter reigns, cities rising and falling on a scale, measured at least in principle, in lifetimes rather than epochs. This is also the point where the King List starts to brush up against other sources. We have to be careful here. The fit is not perfect. Scholars argue about the details constantly. But somewhere in those early post-flood dynasties, the text begins to mention names and places that appear elsewhere. On building inscriptions, in dedicatory plaques, in later literary traditions. Kish, the first post-diluvian city in most versions, is an archaeologically real site north of Babylon with early dynastic levels. Uruk, Adab, Mari, Akkad, all cities named in the King List, are visible in the archaeological record in the 3rd millennium BCE, and in some cases earlier. Some rulers listed for these cities appear on independent inscriptions. Little stone or clay documents recording canal projects, temple constructions, offerings to gods. Not every king in the list has this kind of external anchor, and the sequence the text gives does not match straightforward excavated strata. But the overlap is enough that, from the flood onward, Assyriologists talk about historical horizons and points of contact, rather than pure myth. A classic example is the city of Uruk and its famous king Gilgamesh. The King List includes Gilgamesh as a ruler of Uruk, with a reign of 126 years. We do not have contemporary inscriptions of Gilgamesh himself, and some scholars doubt he was ever a historical person. Others think there may have been a real local ruler behind the later epic hero. Either way, by the time WB 444 was written, Gilgamesh was an established literary figure, and the King List places him inside a dynasty whose other members are more solidly attested. Farther down, the Akkadian rulers Sargon and Naram-Sin appear in the list, as do some kings of whose names you can also read on bricks, stelae, and administrative tablets. Here the King List is clearly intersecting with what we would call history, even if it rearranges, compresses, omits for its own reasons. That partial alignment has led to a kind of two-tiered reading tradition. The antediluvian section is treated as purely schematic or mythic. The post-flood section is treated as historical, but with a lot of caveats. It is selective, it telescopes time, it reorders things to make ideological points. It is not a neutral chronicle, it is one curated version of the past. The sharp break at the flood helps that work. By drawing a hard line between before and after, King List creates a narrative reset. Whatever strange things were true in the old world, the giant reigns, the handful of cities, proximity to the gods, are sealed off behind a catastrophe. What follows is a new dispensation, a world in which kingship has been re-granted, mortality has been normalized, and political history can start again from a fresh baseline. From a legitimizing perspective, that reset is gold. If you are a later king, commissioning or at least endorsing a text like this. You want a story in which the office you hold is cosmic in origin, but now firmly rooted in the human scale. You want to be able to say, kingship itself is older than the flood, older than any city now standing, It was born among the first people who ever organised themselves under a ruler. It survived, and it has come down through a long, carefully traced line to me. The flood allows you to split that story into 2 chapters. Chapter 1, the primordial era, marked off with impossibly long reigns that no ordinary person will ever match. That chapter establishes the antiquity and sacredness of kingship. It is closer to myth than to annals. Chapter 2, the post-flood sequence, where reigns shorten, cities diversify, and the narrative can be tied, at least in spots, to inscriptions, monuments, and living memories. That chapter establishes continuity and specificity. It connects your dynasty to a trackable chain of predecessors. The King List does this by being noticeably more granular after the flood, but it is still not inclusive. Many known rulers never appear. Local dynasties that we see in economic tablets or dedicatory inscriptions are simply skipped. Some cities that were important in their own regions are left out entirely. Even in the parts where the numbers look plausible, we are dealing with an edited tradition, not a sense of everyone who ever held power. This is what it means to say that the list is curating memory. The scribes behind WB 400, 444 and related manuscripts were choosing which kings and which cities counted for the story they wanted to tell. Kish gets pride of place as the first post-flood city because later southern Mesopotamian tradition treated it as an early centre of kingship. Uruk, Ur and Nippur are given prominent roles because they mattered in the political and religious geography of the scribal world. Other places barely appear, or appear only once, even if archaeology suggests long and complex histories on the ground. King List is less interested in representing every polity that ever existed than in mapping a single line of legitimate kingship as it moves from city to city. That selectivity becomes more visible as the text approaches periods we know better from other sources. We'll start seeing instances where a king's reign in the list is clearly smoothed out, rounded to a nicer number, stripped of messy co-regencies and rival claimants we know about from contemporary documents. The ideological purpose peeks through the arithmetic. Yet, from a listener's point of view in the early 2nd millennium BCE, the overall effect would likely have been one of increasing realism, crownals. As the names come closer to your own time, they become figures your grandparents might have mentioned, rulers, whose statues you could still see in temples, whose deeds were sung about in court performances. The early, cloud-wrapped kings recede into legend. The later ones feel anchored in the built landscape around you. The flood line, then, is not only a boundary between mythic and human time. It is also a hinge in the narrative where the King List quietly shifts genres from cosmogonic prologue to something that behaves, at least in parts, like a historical record. The numbers shrink to human size. The cast of cities expands. Cross-references with archaeology and other texts begin to emerge. But the underlying project remains the same: to impose order on the past, to trace a single thread of kingship through an untidy reality, and to define who and what deserves to be remembered, to see just how deliberately the scribes built that order. We need to look more closely at the numerical system they were using, and at the patterns hiding in those reign totals on both sides of the flood. That takes us into the mathematics of base 60. To get inside those reign totals, we have to spend a little time in the Sumerian headspace, and that means letting go, just for a moment, of base 10. We are so used to thinking in tens and hundreds and thousands that it feels natural, inevitable. 10 fingers, 10 digits, the decimal point marching obligingly to the left or right. But the scribes who wrote WB 444 did not live in that numerical universe. Their basic counting framework was sexagesimal, base 60. At first that sounds alien. 60 of what? Why 60? If you zoom out a little, it begins to make intuitive sense. 60 is a very friendly number mathematically. It splits cleanly into halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, sixths, tenths, twelfths, 15ths, 20ths. You can divide it by 2, 3, 4, 5, and still get a whole number. That makes it perfect for a world where numbers are constantly being shared out. Rations, fields, work crews, offerings. Base that divides neatly into many parts is a base that behaves well in everyday life. Think about the way we still use 60 today. 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, 360 degrees in a circle. Those aren't coincidences. They are the fossil remains of the same sexagesimal thinking that structured the King List. In a Based system, place in a number is worth 10 times the one to its right. In base 60, each place is worth 60 times the one to its right. So, if you see a sequence of numerals, what it represents depends on where you imagine the 60 boundary to be. That is where things get tricky for us, and easy for them. Cuneiform numerals did not have a separate symbol for this is the 1's place, this is the 60's place, this is the 3 600's place. A cluster of wedges could mean 1 plus 2, or it could mean 1 times 60 plus 2, 1 times 60 squared, plus 2 times 60, depending on context. Just as the string 12 in our writing could mean 12 units or 12 tens of something, fraction, if we don't say what the units are. The scribes relied on what was being counted. Sheep, silver, days, years, to disambiguate the value, cost. They also had specialized terms for larger packaged units, especially when dealing with time. This is where the famous Sumerian time units come in, ner, sar, and sharu, sometimes written with slightly different spellings in modern publications, but pointing to the same basic idea. Each of these names tagged a particular power of 60. A ner was 600. In sexagesimal terms, that's 10 times 60. Sar was 3,600. 60 times 60, or 60 squared. A sharu could be used for 36,000, and there are related forms for still higher multiples. These weren't just abstract math toys, they were part of the everyday language of administration. A scribe could say, in effect, 3 sars and 2 ners, the way we might say 3,200. Once you have that toolkit, very large figures can be expressed quite compactly and quite systematically. Take one of the antediluvian reigns, 28,800 years. In decimal, that's a mouthful, and it looks absurd on the page. In a sexagesimal framework, 28,800 is exactly 8 sars. 8 neat packets of 3,600. Another king ruled for 36,000 years. That's 10 sars. 43,200? That is 12 sars. Or, if you're thinking in terms of degrees of a circle, 12 full rotations of 3,600. Seen through that lens, the antediluvian section starts to look less like free-form exaggeration, and more like someone laying out a carefully graded scale, not that the numbers become small. 8 sars is still 28,800 years. 10 sars is still 36,000, but when you write them in base 60, you see how often they fall on round, regular units, exact multiples of 60, of 600, 3,600. They line up neatly in a system that scribes used every day for grain, land, and labour. This is one reason modern scholars urge caution when we simply read the king list and numbers as if they were written in modern basin years, no other structure behind them. To an ancient scribe, 10 sars was not just a randomly huge number, but a specific, named block on a familiar numerical ladder. It occupied a clean, legible slot in the architecture of their mathematics. It is also why translating those figures directly into our units without explanation can inflate the sense of mystery. If you tell a modern reader, this king ruled for 36,000 years, but if you put yourself in the scribe's chair and you realise the tablet is saying, this king ruled for 10 sars, what you hear is, this reign occupies a full, round decade of high-order time unit. It is enormous, yes, but it is also tidy. It fits the grid. There is another layer to this, how we reconstruct the numbers at all. Because base 60 numerals are positional, but lack an explicit 0. In the periods when the king list was first composed, later copyists and modern editors sometimes have to decide where to place the boundaries between 1s, 60s, and 60 squares. Small shifts in that boundary can produce big changes in converted values. Move a wedge group one place to the left, multiplied it by 60. Move it one place to the right and you've divided by 60. Over centuries of copying in different cities, and for different purposes, it is not hard to imagine that some reignitor totals might have drifted a place or two, especially in the legendary sections where no one had independent chronological anchors. Most Assyriologists think the antediluvian figures are huge on purpose. But base 60 conventions create room for variant readings and for confusion, especially if you come to them with decimal instincts. All of this feeds into a concept you see again and again in the scholarly literature on Mesopotamian numbers, numerical schematization. When historians say that a text like the King List is schematized, they do not mean that it is made up in a random way. They mean that the numbers have been shaped to fit a pattern rooted in the metrology and mathematics of the culture. For example, a scribe might round reigns so that the total years of a dynasty come to a satisfying multiple of 60, 600, or 3,600. Individual kings might be assigned reigns that echo auspicious numbers or mirror each other across a narrative boundary like the flood. The aim is not to report a set of raw measurements, but to construct a past that is numerically harmonious. In the antediluvian section, that schematization is obvious. 8 kings, enormous but very regular totals, reigns that march up and down in clear multiples of sars and ners. After the flood, the numbers compress and fragment, but traces of the same habit remain. Dynasties whose combined lengths fall on pleasing sexagesimal sums, occasional kings, whose reigns are stretched or trimmed in the manuscripts to hit rounded figures. This does not mean the scribes were indifferent to reality. Some later reigns clearly do reflect remembered or recorded lengths, at least approximately. But the King List is not a spreadsheet. When the historical data did not align neatly with the sexagesimal grid, or with the ideological storyline, the grid often won. Base 60 system is the technical side of that process. It provides the scaffolding, the ladder of units, the positional notation, the named blocks of time that make huge totals feel orderly. Numerical schematization is the cultural side. It is the decision to prioritize that order, to let the structure of the system guide how the past is packaged. It is important to keep those two layers separate. Sexagesimal mathematics can help explain how the numbers in the king list are written, why they cluster around certain multiples, why they translate into such satisfying round figures. It shows us the grammar of the numerals and the habits behind their composition. What it cannot do by itself, tell us why the antediluvian rains had to be so large in the first place, or exactly what those large units were meant to signify to an ancient audience. Even if every figure is a perfect multiple of 60, that still leaves the conceptual question open. Were these kings imagined as literally ruling for 8 or 10 or 12 sars of years? Were those units already metaphorical by the time WB 444 was inscribed, signalling grandeur rather than calendar time? Or were they part of a deeper symbolic pattern, tying the age before the flood to cycles of the heavens or to other cosmic frameworks? Questions of meaning, not just of arithmetic. To approach them, we have to move from the bare mechanics of base 60 to the way numbers themselves functioned as symbols in Sumerian thought, and to the pattern totals that start to emerge. When you step back from the individual reigns and look at the king list as a whole, once you start thinking of sars and ners as steps on a ladder, it becomes much easier to imagine that the reign lengths in the king list might be doing more than just counting years. They may be acting as magnitudes. In other words, matters is not. How many calendar years did this king actually sit on the throne? But where on the scale of greatness or antiquity, cosmic importance, does this king belong? That way of using numbers is not unique to Mesopotamia. You can see it across the ancient Near East, far beyond. In biblical texts, people before the flood live for 777 years, or 969 years, clean multiples of 70. In early Chinese chronicles, reigns and dynasties sometimes come out to rounded totals that match cosmological cycles. In Egyptian king lists, certain pharaohs are given impossibly long spans to fill out neat historical blocks. The pattern is always the same. Once you cross a certain boundary into mythic time, divine time, time before we remember, numbers begin to stretch and smooth. They no longer read like measurements taken from life. They read like titles. When a Sumerian scribe writes that a single antediluvian king ruled 10 sars, that phrase is doing 2 jobs at once. On one level, it is a unit of time, 36,000. On another level, it is an honorific. This king occupies a full decade of the largest named time unit in our system. He has filled a whole block of cosmic time. You can hear the difference if you compare it to how we sometimes speak. We say someone waited 1,000,000 years for an email reply, that an ancient city is thousands of years old, even if the exact figure is 743. The number signals mood and magnitude, not a careful count. The king list is more disciplined than that. It is not just throwing around random huge figures. It is fitting reigns into a very structured grid. But it is worth keeping in mind that even a structured grid can be symbolic. Ancient Mesopotamian texts often use large, neat numbers that are signal qualities to signal qualities that are not strictly quantitative. Round sexagesimal total can suggest completeness. A sequence that climbs and then falls can suggest rise and decline. Petition can evoke stability. Symmetry across a dividing line can hint at cosmic balance. Before and after, above and below, time before the flood and the time after. When scholars go hunting for patterns in the king list, this is the sort of thing they look for. Start with the most obvious one. 8 kings before the flood. 8 is not an accident. Other Mesopotamian traditions mention 8 generations before the deluge, or 8 sages who brought the arts of civilization. Later compilers add more names, but the version we have on WB 444 holds the line at 8. That is a decision. Now put those 8 next to the enormous, very regular reign totals they carry. 28,800 years, 36,000, 43,200, each one sitting exactly on a clean multiple of Sa or Ner. No odd remainders, no messy little additions. Few add up the reigns of the antediluvian kings in some versions of the text. The total itself lands on a satisfyingly round figure. A big, smooth multiple of 60 or 600. The exact sum varies between manuscripts, which tells you that copyists were willing to adjust individual reigns to preserve that overall harmony. That is a crucial clue. It suggests that the total span of the antediluvian era may have mattered more than the precise length assigned to any one king, long as the entire block from kingship descended from heaven to the flood swept over. Added up to the right order of magnitude, scribes had some flexibility in how they distributed the years internally. You can perceive the same habit lower down the list. After the flood, reigns come back down toward recognizably human lengths, but dynasties as a whole often end on rounded numbers. Tidy hundreds, exact multiples of 60, occasionally 3,600. The individual kings' reigns are irregular, but when you sum them, rough edges fall away. In some cases, manuscripts disagree by a year or two here, a year or two there, yet still deliver the same dynasty total. It is as if the scribe is adjusting the furniture inside the house while keeping the outer walls the same size. That is what schematization looks like when you are using numbers symbolically. Tune the components so that the overall figure hits the desired resonance point. Patterns also emerge in how the big antediluvian reigns are distributed. Some sequences step up in neat increments, an extra Sa here, another there, before dropping sharply at the moment of the flood. That creates a sense of building intensity, swelling of kingly magnitude that finally breaks under divine judgment. It turns the numerical profile of the list into a kind of story arc. There are also echoes between pre- and post-flood figures. A very long reign before the flood might be mirrored, in miniature, by the combined lengths of several kings after the flood. A full Sa on one side of the catastrophe might be answered by 10 Ners, or by an artful combination that lands on the same total. Not all scholars agree on the details, and not every proposed correspondence is convincing, but the fact that you can even look for such echoes tells you that symmetry was available as a tool. Why would this matter to the people compiling a list of kings? Because a king list is not just about the kings. It is about the structure of time, by lining up reigns so that they fall into pattern totals. 8 rulers filling an enormous round block of before time, later dynasties adding up to other rounded sums. The king list presents history as something ordered, measured, and ultimately governed by a higher arithmetic. Kingship does not just bounce around randomly between cities and rulers, it flows through carefully weighed periods marked off in units that resonate with the same sexagesimal system used to divide land and calculate offerings and track the movements of the heavens. That sense of order has political implications. If your dynasty happens to sit at the end of a block that sums to a beautiful multiple of 600, or your city receives kingship at the precise turning point between one numerically complete era and the next, that is a powerful bit of ideological capital. It suggests that your rule is not just the latest twist in a messy story, but the fulfillment or beginning of a numerically significant age. In that context, individual reign lengths can become negotiable. Scribe, drawing on older traditions, might know that a certain early king ruled for a very long time. Turning that impression into 12 sars rather than 9 sars and 3 ners is not so much falsifying as fitting. Choice allows the larger structure. The total for the antediluvian period, the symmetry across the flood, patterning of dynasties. Even at the humbler end of the list, where we are closer to historical ground, there are hints of the same mentality. Some reigns are conspicuously round. 30 years, 40 years, 60 years. Sitting like little islands of symbolic neatness amid more jagged sequences. It is hard to prove that those figures are not precisely accurate. It is just as hard to shake the feeling that they have been trimmed and tucked for elegance. At this point, it is tempting to go hunting for a master key. You can imagine, for example, that the total antediluvian span was meant to represent a certain number of great years of some planetary cycle, or that the combined reigns up to a certain dynasty encode a grand calendrical scheme. Various reconstructions along these lines have been proposed. Some try to tie the numbers to 36,000-year precessional cycles, or to complex schemes of planetary periods. Host. The difficulty is that the evidence does not converge on a single agreed pattern. Different versions of the King List preserve slightly different totals. Other Mesopotamian texts that deal explicitly with astronomy and hemerology use overlapping, but not identical numerical structures. It is certainly possible that relationships existed in the minds of some scribes, but we cannot point to one encompassing blueprint and say with confidence. This is what the antediluvian numbers mean. What we can say is more modest, more secure. The reign lengths in the Sumerian King List, especially before the flood, are not behaving like straightforward archival data. Sit on named units of time. They cluster in exact multiples of 60, 600, and 3,600. Their totals line up in ways that suggest deliberate rounding and adjustment. They show signs of being shaped to create symmetry, completion, pleasing sums. Within that framework, large numbers can act as symbols of greatness, antiquity, and cosmic order just as much as, or more than, literal counts of years. Whether those patterns were meant to echo specific celestial cycles, to mirror other mythic traditions, simply to make the past feel orderly and complete, remains an open question. Different cities, different schools, different periods may well have attached different layers of meaning to the same impressive figures. Meaning. To get at those layers, we have to look not only at the math and the patterns, but at the social work a text like the King List was doing. How numerical order helped it define who inherited kingship, and on what terms. When you look at the King List as a piece of political technology, a lot of the weirdness starts to make a different kind of sense. At the most basic level, it is doing something very practical for early Mesopotamian rulers. It is drawing a single, continuous line of authority through a past that was anything but continuous. Real history in southern Mesopotamia was messy. Multiple cities could have rulers at the same time. Local dynasties overlapped, fought, intermarried, broke apart. Power did not flow neatly from one city's throne room to the next like a relay race baton. It was patchy and competitive. King List quietly erases most of that complexity. On W444 and related copies, kingship is treated as if it were a single, indivisible thing. It descends from heaven, once lands in one city at a time, and then moves on in a clean sequence. Kish, then Uruk, then then Awan, and so on down the line. Principle: one kingship at a time is not a neutral description. It is an ideological choice, takes a fractured political landscape, and reimagines it as a single office that can only rightly reside in one place in each generation. Everybody else who thought they were ruling during that period. In the logic of the text, they were not kings. At best, they were local strongmen, worst, usurpers. This is where the selectivity of the list becomes important. The king list does not simply gather every name it can find, filters. It omits awkward figures, compresses periods of chaos, and foregrounds lines that are useful for its narrative of rightful succession. We can see this by comparing it with other sources. Inscriptions from individual cities preserve names of rulers who never make it onto the king list at all. In some cases, we know that two dynasties were active at roughly the same time, one in the north and one in the south. Yet the list assigns kingship to only one city for that span and pushes the other line into an earlier or later slot, or ignores it. What looks, on the surface, like a chronological table, is underneath a map of recognition and exclusion. Being on the king list is not just a matter of existing. It is a mark of having been accepted, at least by some later scribal tradition, part of the legitimate flow of kingship. Falling off the list is a quiet act of damnatio memoriae. Your monuments might still stand in your home city. Your name might still circulate in local tales. But in the grand, to city history of real kings, you vanish. This editing power is clearest in the later portions of the text, closer to the time when it was being copied. Some versions of the king list end with the dynasty of Isin, push a bit further, or cut off earlier. Those stopping points are not accidental, correspond to moments the city that then happened to be preserving and copying the text could plausibly claim to stand at the current endpoint, legitimate kingship. In other words, the text keeps being updated so that the line of kings arrives conveniently at us. That is what it means to use the past as a political resource. If you can present your government as the latest link in a single, heaven-derived chain that runs all the way back through Kish, and even into the enormous reigns of antediluvian kings, powerful argument that your rule is not just the result of luck conquest or clever alliances. It is the way things are supposed to be. Continuity from deep time is doing a lot of work here. The opening lines about kingship descending from heaven, the 8 pre-flood kings, the impossibly long reigns measured out in pristine Sars and Nurs. None of that is just there for atmosphere, stretches the story of kingship back beyond the flood, beyond human memory, into a realm where divine action is unquestioned. Kingship is as old as those 28,800-year reigns, and if the same kingship can be traced step by step from that remote era right down to the city currently in charge, then the present dynasty inherits not only the throne, but the weight of cosmic antiquity. That is the political payoff of numerical grandeur. Vast spans of time make the institution of kingship feel primordial. Clean, patterned totals make its movement from city to city feel guided rather than arbitrary. Paused. When your own dynasty appears as the latest segment in that smoothly measured sequence, your rule can be framed as the natural, almost inevitable outcome of a process that began when the gods first handed kingship to Eridu or Kish. This is also why the King List is willing to compress and stretch time so aggressively. Periods of fragmentation. When multiple cities had rulers with overlapping claims, are often telescoped down into short, tidy dynasties. Troubled episodes can be represented by a few exceptionally short reigns, or by skipping whole lines altogether. Conversely, favoured cities can receive long, well-ordered dynasties, whose summed reigns land on satisfying multiples of 60 or 600. Peace and order themselves could be expressed through round numbers. Structure implicitly tells you which eras were real kingship and which were aberrations. Chaotic times shrink into gaps between numerically complete blocks, or into brief, jagged subsequences that break the smooth flow before order is restored. Calm, legitimate sequences expand to fill larger, well-measured spans. The math and the politics reinforce each other. Consider again that rule of one kingship at a time, by denying that more than one true kingship can exist simultaneously. The text makes a strong claim about sovereignty in general. Kingship is not a resource that cities can share. It is a singular office that must be located somewhere. If you are on the list for a given period, everyone else is, by definition, secondary. If your rival city claims a glorious antiquity, but the King List quietly assigns its flourishing to a time when another city officially had kingship, your rival's past becomes, in this framework, kind of historic noise. This is why control over the tradition matters. Scribes in different cities copied slightly different versions of the King List. They could introduce local emphasis, extending the glory of their own dynasty, trimming the prestige of their neighbours, adjusting reigns, so that certain transitions lined up with significant events or pleasing totals. The underlying template of one kingship at a time gave them the skeleton. The specific names, lengths, boundaries were where politics could enter. In that light, the enormous antediluvian numbers can be seen as the ideological foundation under all this later manoeuvring. Those quasi-cosmic reigns establish that kingship is older than any particular city, older even than the flood. By defining that deep time in terms of vast, rounded magnitudes, the text turns history into something that feels geologic. Long, layered, inevitable, later dynasties, even when their individual reigns are down in human ranges. 12 years here, 36 there, are still positioned against that background of tens of thousands of years. No matter how fragile they were in reality, on the tablet they sit inside a story that has been running since the gods first delegated rule. When the numbers behave grandly, present looks less contingent. The choice to give one antediluvian king precisely 10 sars instead of 9 and a bit is not just a mathematical flourish. It is part of a long argument that kingship arrives in solid, measured blocks, that transitions between cities happened at numerically meaningful thresholds, and that whoever currently holds the office stands at the culmination of an unimaginably long, carefully apportioned sequence. Seen this way, the Sumerian King List is not simply trying to remember the past. It parcels out antiquity, legitimacy, divine favour in quantified doses. It decides which cities get to claim that kingship truly dwelt with them, and which have to content themselves with local memories. It assigns not only years to kings, but kingship to years, and it does all of this through the same sexagesimal language of sars and ners that it uses to inflate the ages of pre-flood rulers. The huge numbers and the political messaging are not separate layers. They are part of the same toolkit. To seize how that toolkit was developed, and how professional scribes learned to handle these traditions, We have to zoom in on the people actually copying and recopying WB 444 and its cousins, the students in the scribal schools, and the textual culture that grew up around lists like this. What? If you were a student in a Mesopotamian scribal school, a tablet like the King List would not have been some museum piece under glass. It would have been homework. We know this of what has turned up in the ruins of those schools. In cities like Nippur, and Sippar, archaeologists have found whole rooms full of discarded tablets. Many of them are exercises. You can see the progression. On one side, a neat, carefully written model text, usually produced by a teacher. On the other, a clumsier version where a student has tried to copy the lines, sometimes with wrong signs, sometimes with corrections squeezed in. Among these we find pieces of king lists. They are not always complete. Some are only a column or two, or just the opening antediluvian section, or a stretch of post-flood dynasties. But they show that this wasn't just an elite ceremonial inscription, it was part of the core curriculum. From a teacher's perspective, that makes sense. A king list is the perfect training device. It gives you personal names, often spelled in difficult, archaic ways. It gives you city names and divine names. It gives you numbers in all sorts of formats. Simple integers, big composite totals, regular reigns, then those enormous antediluvian spans that force you to handle sexagesimal notation at full stretch. And it does all of this in a highly formulaic frame. X was king, he ruled years. Z kings, they ruled years. Again and again, line after line, like grammatical drills. If you can copy and understand a text like that, you are learning more than just how to scratch wedges into clay. You are internalizing patterns of language and arithmetic that run through the whole written culture. This is one reason the King List could remain so stable over centuries. Once a text becomes a standard school piece, it develops inertia. Teachers teach the version they themselves learned. Students copy it repeatedly. Any tablet you happen to dig out of the ground is only one snapshot. Behind that tablet lies a chain of copying, stretching back through generations of apprentices and masters. At the same time, this process does not freeze a text. It stabilizes it around a moving target. Every act of copying is an opportunity for variation. Some of those variations are simple mistakes. A student misreads a sign, drops a line, miscalculates a total. Sometimes you can watch the correction process in real time. The teacher has gone back over the tablet, erased a sign in the still wet clay, and impressed the right one above it. Other times, the error stands, and that flawed tablet might itself be used years later as a secondary model. When you compare surviving copies, you can see this layering. One version will give a king 24 years, another 28. One will list 8 pre-flood kings, another squeezes in a 9th or rearranges their order. The overall skeleton, kingship descending, moving from city to city, flood in the middle, dynasties of Kish and and so on, holds steady, but the flesh on that skeleton is constantly being nudged and patched. Not all changes are accidents. Scribes were trained professionals, passive photocopiers. Part of their job was to make texts make sense in their own time. Imagine you are a late old Babylonian student in Nippur, the version of the king. List, your city uses, has been around in one form or another for centuries. But your own dynasty wants a certain arrangement of names, a certain endpoint for the line of kings, a certain picture of how power flowed. Copy the list, except at the places where your local tradition, or your teacher, or your patron expects something different. You might add a local ruler who has recently been accepted as real by your community's memory. You might slightly extend or trim a reign length so that the total of a dynasty lands neatly on a multiple of 60. Post. You might choose one spelling of a city name over another, because that is how your region now writes it. Over time, these micro-adjustments accumulate. Some of them are conscious ideological tweaks, like the ones we saw in the previous section, emphasizing Isin, downplaying Larsa, or vice versa. Others are less intentional but still meaningful, miscopied number that happens to be close in the sexagesimal system, and therefore passes unchallenged, misunderstood archaic sign that gets regularized into a more familiar form. The result is a text that feels stable, because the main narrative and many of the numbers repeat from copy to copy. But that is actually breathing. You can think of it like a traditional song passed down by ear. The melody and chorus are recognizable across villages, but each community adds little twists, forgets a verse, or introduces a new stanza that fits their experience. Over centuries, you end up with families of related songs, not a single frozen original. The King List behaves the same way on clay. This is important for how we think about those giant antediluvian reigns. On WB 444, pre-flood section is already archaizing. The scribe is writing in a style that looks old-fashioned even for his time. Some names are strange, and probably drawn from much older tales or lists. The gigantic numbers are expressed in clean sexagesimal chunks. 5 sars, 8 sars, 10 sars, as if they belong to a well-established pattern. By the period when WB 444 was inscribed, the living understanding of what those numbers originally signified may already have been blurred. A much earlier tradition might have used them as symbolic markers, or as parts of a cosmological scheme, or simply as heroic figures associated with mythic ancestors. Later scribes learned that antediluvian kings have extraordinarily long reigns, and that these reigns come in multiples of Sar and Ner. They also learned the narrative structure. Kingship before the flood, kingship after. They did not necessarily inherit the full conceptual toolkit that first produced those values. So when a student in a scribal house in, say, the early 2nd millennium BCE sits down to copy the opening of the King List, they are imitating a model whose deepest logic is only partly visible to them. They know are supposed to write Enmanluana, king of Badibira, ruled 28,800 years. They know that 28,800 equals 8 sars. That 8 sars is a pleasing regular unit. But if you ask them, why exactly 28,800? Why not 21,600 or 36,000? They might not have a clear, articulated answer. At that point, the numbers have become part of what it means for the text to sound authoritative. Enormous, round figures belong to the pre-flood world in the same way that certain stock phrases belong to incantations or certain metaphors belong to hymns. They are markers of genre and antiquity. You keep them because they make the text feel properly old. Because your teacher's tablet had them. Because their shapes in sexagesimal are elegant. This is how copying can preserve an older tradition, even as its meaning drifts. Crucially, it also explains why we get both stability and variation in the reign length. The antediluvian figures are often consistent across copies, at least in their broad magnitudes. Tens of thousands of years, clean Sar-based totals, That suggests that by the time the King List enters scribal curricula, the huge numbers are already canonical features. Changing them would not just be a small edit, it would be tampering with the aura of deep time embedded in the text. But within that frame, small shifts can and do happen. A scribe misreads one 6 sign for another, or mistakenly adds a ner, drops a line, and then patches the total by slightly inflating a neighbouring reign. In sexagesimal notation, there are multiple ways to write the same value, and the visual similarity of signs can facilitate drift. Over generations, some branches of the tradition end up with 36,000 years where others have 28,800, while still remaining recognisably part of the same narrative whole. From the inside, for the scribes themselves, this is not a problem to be solved. It is simply how texts work. A list like WB 444 is not an inscription, in the modern sense, with a single fixed wording set in stone. It is one performance of a composition that exists as a network of remembered lines, school tablets, monumental copies, and local variants. Different cities maintain their own exemplars. Teachers choose which ones to canonize. Students carry those choices with them when they take jobs in temples or palaces and commission new copies. The life of the King List is this chain of hands and eyes and styluses stretching over centuries. When we stare at the colossal reigns of the antediluvian kings and try to decode them, we are looking at a cross-section through that living manuscript culture. Some parts of what we see go back very far indeed. The idea of pre-flood kingship, the association with particular cities like Eridu and Bad Tibira, the use of sars and ners to register almost unimaginable spans. Other parts are the product of schoolroom habits, corrections, misunderstandings, and the quiet ideological choices of later dynasties. The numbers are not the product of a single act of invention, the residue of many acts of copying. To understand what they might have meant, and how those meanings could shift over time, we now have to look at how scribes not only listed kings, but arranged those kings in time, folding multiple local sequences into one, squeezing overlapping histories into neat lines, and sometimes bending chronology itself to fit their patterns. If you look at WB 444 as a timeline, it feels very simple. One king at a time, one city at a time. Kingship descends at the beginning. Then it is carried off to the next city, then to the next. Host. Each dynasty gets a clean starting point and a clean end point, with nobody stepping on anyone else's toes. Mesopotamian history did not behave like that. Already in the early dynastic period, when some of the historical kings on the list actually lived, we can see something very different in the archaeological and textual record. City. States jostling side by side, rival kings claiming the same titles, coalitions forming and breaking, of local rulers who matter a great deal in one region and almost not at all in another. King List flattens all of that into a single file. That flattening is one of the main ways you can get huge totals without anyone needing to. Imagine a man literally sitting on a throne for 36,000 solar years. Imagine you have 3 neighbouring cities, each with its own proud story of first kings and golden ages. In reality, their early dynasties overlap. City A's founding house is ruling at roughly the same time as City B's, and both are contemporaneous with at least some of City C's rulers. Each preserves its own sequence, as if it were the entire story of the land. Now, picture a scribe whose job is to turn those three separate streams into one national history. He can't write three parallel columns with arrows showing overlaps. He doesn't have the modern tools of charts and graphs and synoptic tables. His genre is the single-line reign list, kingship moving from one place to another in a dignified procession. To fit the stories together, he stitches them. He takes City A's founding dynasty and lays it down first. Then he tacks on City B's founding kings after that, City C's after that. What were once three partially overlapping sequences in real time become three fully consecutive blocks in list time. You have not lengthened any individual reign. You have lengthened history itself. If each local tradition already counted its kings in generous, stylized numbers, our founder ruled 300 years. Our second king ruled 240. Then stacking them end to end multiplies, generous spans. Your total for the time before the flood grows, not because you have increased the lifespan of any one person, because you have taken multiple, partly redundant stories and made them march in single file, is not just theoretical. We can see later versions of the King List, experimenting with where to splice dynasties, which cities get foregrounded, which sequences are treated as primary. Certain rulers appear in more than one tradition under slightly different names or with different titles. When an editor chooses one version as canonical and then adds the other as a follow-on dynasty rather than a contemporary line, apparent time expands. Overlapping kingships create another sort of inflation. Mesopotamian cities routinely had local rulers who were, in practice, kings, even if they officially acknowledged a hegemon somewhere else. A king of Kish might be king of the four quarters in his own inscriptions, while letting a local strongman in Lagash call himself Ensi, ruler of that city. For the people of Lagash, their Ensi was the main figure. For the people of Kish, their own king was central. When a pan-regional list tries to reconcile these memories, it tends to resolve ambiguity by sequencing. Instead of, while X was king at Kish, Y ruled at Lagash, you get X, king of Kish, ruled N years, full stop, followed by Y, king of Lagash, ruled M years. Parallel authority becomes serial authority. Time that was shared becomes time that is added. The longer and more tangled the political landscape, the more opportunities there are for this kind of compression. This is also where double counting can sneak in. Names repeat in Mesopotamian onomastics. Abundant divine elements, Enlil, Nana, Inanna, Shamash, get combined with verbs and adjectives in countless ways. Over centuries, you can easily end up with the crow, a host. You can easily end up with 2 or 3 rulers whose names look similar enough that a later scribe might treat them as versions of the same figure. When those local traditions are folded together, an editor has choices. He can treat them as distinct kings and list them separately, making the timeline longer. Or he can merge them, especially if one version comes with a particularly memorable epithet or number. Legendary city founder. With a reign of 1,200 years from one tradition and a similarly named ancestor with 600 years from another, can be telescoped into a single great king who ruled 1,800, or conversely, one figure can be split into 2, with his deeds distributed across different cities. The King List itself hints at this process. Some antediluvian kings are tied firmly to one city in WB 444, but appear with different associations or slight name variants in other texts. In the historical sections, a ruler might be presented in one source as the last of one dynasty, and in another as the first of the next. Moving that hinge point by even one name changes how many years get counted under each city's heading, how the grand totals line up with schematic expectations. Telescoping doesn't only happen with individuals. It can happen with entire dynasties. Suppose a local tradition preserves a ragged stretch of early rulers, some named, some half remembered, some just 3 kings whose names have been forgotten. Another city's tradition has its own ragged list for the same general period. A later editor, faced with gaps, may compress several half-known houses into a neat block of X kings. They ruled Y years, with Y chosen to be a pleasing, round value in base 60. Loose memories are pulled into tight packages. Chronology becomes smooth. This smoothing is where schematic numbers do their work. We have already seen that SARS and NERS, units of 3,000, 600 and 600, dominate the antediluvian reigns. They also appear in dynasty totals. When an editor is trying to reconcile variant local figures, it is very tempting to adjust a few reign lengths so that the sum for a dynasty lands on, say, 3 SARS exactly, rather than 3 SARS plus 40. He might shave a little from one king, add a little to another, or round up a messy, inherited total to the nearest neat value, POS. In some copies we can see this at work. Individual reigns differ slightly, but the dynastic total remains the same across versions, as if that higher level number has become the anchor, and the individual entries are the adjustable parts. Over centuries, multiple rounds of such adjustment can produce reigns that look huge and precise, while being, at heart, the result of arithmetic retrofitting. And remember, this retrofitting is happening on top of already conflated material. First, overlapping dynasties get laid out in a straight line. Then, names and stories from different cities are merged under shared labels. Then, gaps are filled and edges smoothed with rounded, symbolic numbers. Every step lengthens the apparent age of the world as seen through the King List, without anyone sitting down and saying, "Let's make our ancestors live for 28,800 literal years." In this light, magnitude of the antediluvian numbers looks less like a biological claim about individual lifespans and more like the cumulative byproduct of historiographical choices. Start with multiple, partly mythic genealogies. Force them into a single royal road, from kingship descended from heaven to the present dynasty. Respect local pride by including as many remembered rulers as possible. Keep the math elegant by working in base 60 blocks. Pair contradictions by nudging figures until the totals behave. Do this process enough times, and you can easily end up with tens of thousands of years. Before the flood, even if the underlying memories might originally have referred to shorter, more human scales, or even to something other than time altogether. This does not mean conflation explains everything. Even allowing for stacked dynasties, doubled names, and smooth totals, the antediluvian reigns on WB 444 are still extraordinary. They belong to a different register than the post-flood sections. Their extremity is part of the point. But conflated dynasties and compressed timelines show how you can get from a messy landscape of local traditions to a single authoritative tablet that confidently tells you, in one column of cuneiform, that 8 kings ruled for 241,200 years before the waters came. To see how that tablet fits into an even wider imagination of deep time, we have to step outside WB 444 for a moment and look at what other Mesopotamian texts do with floods, ages, and the hazy world before ordinary history begins. When you step outside the King List and look around Mesopotamian literature, you start to notice something. The flood isn't just an event. It's a hinge. In W444, flood cuts the list into two clean halves, before and after. On one side, 8 antediluvian kings whose reigns are measured in colossal base 60 blocks. On the other, dynasties that look, by comparison, almost modestly human. The moment the flood swept over the land, the math changes. That same dividing line shows up elsewhere. In Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian texts, floods are not routine seasonal annoyances. They are cosmic reset buttons. They mark the end of one arrangement of the world and the beginning of another. And they often appear right where people are trying to talk about deep time, about the hazy stretch of existence before their own institutions and calendars make sense. The Sumerian flood story, preserved on a tablet from Nippur, gives one version. The gods decide to annihilate humankind with a deluge. The god Enkidu whispers the plan to Ziusudra, a pious king, and instructs him to build a huge boat. Ziusudra survives, offers sacrifice, granted life in Dilmun. The flood destroys cities, kingship, ordinary time. Then, in its wake, the world is reordered. Old Babylonian epic of Atrahasis tells a similar story with more detail. Human beings are noisy. The gods are tired and can't sleep. Trying plague and famine, they unleash a final flood. Atrahasis, warned in advance, constructs a ship, rides out the storm, becomes the ancestor of post-flood humanity. Again, what matters is not just the water, but the before and after it creates. Pre-flood humanity lives in a different arrangement with the gods. Post-flood humanity is subject to new rules. Shorter lifespans, infant mortality, social controls to keep population in check. By the time you get to the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, the pattern is firmly established. Napishtim, the flood survivor, lives at the mouth of the rivers, in a kind of timeless elsewhere. Gilgamesh goes to see him specifically because Ut-Napishtim belongs to that earlier, unreachable age. He has crossed a boundary that no ordinary king can cross. He remembers a world before the flood, and has been granted a strange extension of existence beyond it. That is what makes him worth seeking out. Put the King List beside these texts, and they start to look like different expressions of the same mental move. Draw a line through time, call it the flood, and let it do heavy conceptual lifting. On one side, an age when kingship descends from heaven into cities whose names feel half mythical, inhabited by rulers, whose reigns spill out in Sars and Nurs. An age much closer to the world the scribes actually know, populated by dynasties whose lengths can be argued about, reconciled with inscriptions used to structure school exercises. The flood is the seam between mythic prehistory and historical memory. That doesn't mean the King List is just a prose retelling of any one flood myth. It isn't. WB 444 barely narrates the event at all. The flood is a single phrase, almost an intertitle. Then the flood swept over. No ark, no animals, no speeches by worried gods. The function is structural, not narrative. List uses the flood, the way later chronographers use the birth of Christ or the founding of Rome as a pivot point for the flood and after the flood, become organizing labels that compress a wide range of stories and memories into something that feels like a single, intelligible timeline. The antediluvian section is where this really matters. 8 kings and 241,200 years do not just say long ago. They say another order of reality, Mesopotamian thought. The world before a cosmic catastrophe is often qualitatively different from the world after. Conditions are looser, boundaries less fixed, the traffic between divine and human realms more open. The King List encodes that difference in numbers. Pre-flood reigns are not only long, they are cleanly built out of large base 60 units. Their neatness is almost abstract. These are not the shaky negotiated totals of historical dynasties. They read like measures in a cosmic register, the way you might count the ages of gods or the cycles of the heavens. Once the flood has done its work, reign lengths drop dramatically and start to behave much more like the figures you get when you try to remember. In human terms, who ruled when? In other words, the flood is not just a historical claim. It is a marker that tells you, as a reader, the rules are about to change. This is very close to what you see in Atrahasis. The god Enlil complains that humans have multiplied and become loud. The flood is his solution. After it, the gods agree to new population controls, so they do not have to destroy the world again. The deluge is the moment when infinite growth becomes finite, when the open-ended fertility of the first humans gets capped. In narrative form, that is a story about why people don't live forever and why suffering exists. In list form, on WB 444, it becomes a shift from vast multiples of 3,600 to reigns you could, in principle, write into an administrative year name. Scholars are careful here. It is tempting to line everything up into one tidy scheme. Antediluvian kings with superhuman reigns, flood myths that explain shortened lifespans, later traditions like Genesis, where patriarchs live for hundreds of years before a deluge, and much less after. You can start to see all of it as one neat continuous tradition of declining ages. The evidence doesn't quite justify that level of confidence. We can say that Mesopotamian texts consistently treat the flood as a rupture. We can say that extremely long lives, long reigns, and an easier flow between worlds tend to appear on the far side of that rupture. We can say that the King List, flood stories, and epics like Gilgamesh all make use of that pattern way, each in their own. Beyond that, the connections are more about shared motifs and habits of thought than about direct borrowing. King List is interested in institutional continuity, kingship, cities, dynasties. The flood stories are interested in divine policy, why the gods act, how they correct their own mistakes, what rules now govern human existence. Gilgamesh uses the flood as a backdrop for a meditation on mortality. What they share is a strategy for thinking about deep time. Pooh. If you live in a world where people already tell stories about ancient kings, about strange, half-diving ancestors, about disasters that wiped out everything recognizable, you can organize all that into something like a history by drawing a bright line through it. On one side of the line, you cluster all the stories that feel too far away to verify. On the other, you place the period that feels close enough to be checked against monuments, year names, temple archives. The line itself gets dramatized as a flood. Once that structure is in place, the numbers on WB 444 stop looking like random exaggerations and start looking like participants in that same architecture of time. The flood is the reason the antediluvian section can afford to be so extreme, of course, because it is fenced off by catastrophe. Its reigns do not have to dovetail neatly with later chronologies. they can be as vast and schematized as tradition and base. 60 arithmetic will allow, without threatening anyone's sense of how long an actual human life can be. Viewed this way, the huge antediluvian totals do double work. They honour the depth and dignity of a sacred prehistory, a time when kingship first came down, when the great cities were founded, when the landscape of gods and humans was still being drawn. And they make the post-flood period feel grounded and relatable by contrast. Once the waters have passed, kings live in a world that looks like ours. More constrained, more fragile, bounded by mortality and political accident. Flood divide, then, is not just a chronological breakpoint. It's a meaning-making device. It tells you how to feel about the numbers on either side. Gigantic reigns before become a feature, not a bug. They belong to an age when the scale of things is supposed to feel out of reach. Modest reigns after become a sign that we have entered the domain of ordinary history. Scribes can argue over missing years and competing dynasties. And this is why the numerical shift in the king list feels purposeful. Flood is doing more than interrupting the column. It is underwriting the change from base 60 cosmic spans to human-sized rule, takes what might otherwise look like wild inconsistency and turns it into a story about two worlds separated by water. Of course, even with that narrative scaffold, the specific magnitudes, 241,200 years for 8 kings, remain startling, positioning the list, alongside other flood traditions, helps us see the logic of the divide. But it doesn't fully explain how those particular figures were chosen. For that, we have to look at what happens when modern readers meet these numbers, and why, thousands of years later, they still can't resist trying to decode them. When modern readers meet those antediluvian reigns, they don't just shrug and move on, they reach for explanations. One of the most popular frameworks today is the ancient-astronaut, or Anunnaki, reading of the King List. It shows up in books, documentaries, YouTube videos, and long forum threads where people try to reconcile the numbers on WB 440, 4, with a very different kind of story about the past. In that narrative, the gigantic reigns are not symbolic at all. They are literal records of non-human rulers. The logic usually runs like this. The text says, kingship descended from heaven. The earliest kings rule for tens of thousands of years. Later Mesopotamian myths describe the Anunna or Anunnaki as great gods who decree fates, live in the sky, and interact with humans. Put those pieces together, add a modern vocabulary of advanced beings and genetic engineering, glory, and you get a picture where those early kings are interpreted as extraterrestrial visitors, with extended lifespans and superior technology, ruling over early humans who misperceived them as gods. In its more elaborate forms, this framework goes further. The numbers on the king list are treated as clues to alien biology or orbital periods. The base 60 structure is linked to star cycles. Flood is reimagined as an engineered reset, a planetary cleanup operation after some kind of failed experiment. The later, shorter reigns become evidence that direct alien rule ended, and humans were left to govern themselves under new constraints. Within that story, B. And 44 is not just a literary artifact. It is a scrambled technical report, a dim echo of actual contact. You can see why this appeals. First, the raw numbers really are shocking. If you come to the text with modern expectations, lifespans measured in decades, governments turning over every few years, 241,200 years. For 8 kings reads like a problem begging for a solution. The ancient-astronaut reading simply takes the shock at face value. If it sounds inhuman, maybe it was inhuman. Second, mythology itself feels alien. The King List opens with kingship descending from heaven into a city. Later myths talk about gods flying in chariots, meeting in assembly, sending floods, granting eternal life to a single survivor. To a modern mind raised on space travel and science fiction, it is easy to swap heaven for orbit gods, for visitors, third, and read the whole thing as a technologically misdescribed contact event. Third, there are genuine gaps and uncertainties in our understanding. We don't know exactly where the King List was first compiled. We don't know the complete textual tradition behind its antediluvian section. We can see the mathematical patterning of the long reigns, but we can't be entirely certain why those specific totals and not others were chosen. Where there is uncertainty, imagination moves in. Speculative frameworks thrive in the spaces where scholarship has to admit, we're not sure yet. Finally, the text feels distant enough that people are willing to project. This is not a royal inscription boasting about a single battle, or an economic tablet listing barley rations. It is a cold, compressed sequence of names and numbers from nearly 4,000 years ago, written in a script most people can't read, coming from a worldview that takes gods, omens, and cosmic floods for granted. That distance creates a kind of vacuum. The less familiar the context, the easier it is to insert your own. So what does mainstream scholarship actually say here? If you survey Assyriologists, cuneiform specialists, and historians of Mesopotamia, you do not find support for the idea that the King List is describing literal extraterrestrial rulers. There are a few reasons for that. First, text itself never says that the antediluvian kings are non-human. It calls them Lugal in Sumerian, using the same word it uses for later, fully historical rulers. There is no switch in vocabulary that would signal different kind of being. Second, the idea of kingship descending from heaven is not unique to the King List, and is not restricted to the antediluvian period in Mesopotamian thought. Divine sanction is standard political language. Later, fully historical rulers also talk about how the gods called them, chose them, gave them the scepter. The down from heaven motif belongs to that religious politics, not to a distinct class of beings. Third, when the Anunnaki appear in myths and hymns, they are gods, judges of the underworld, members of divine councils, not described as flesh and blood, rulers with palaces and year names. The King List, by contrast, is all about cities, dynasties, and reign lengths. The overlap between the two corpora is conceptual, not literal. The list does not identify any specific king as an Anunnaki or as a god incarnate. Fourth, the huge reigns fit very neatly into the numerical habits we can see elsewhere. They are clean multiples of SARS and NERS, the large base 60 units used in astronomical and theological contexts. The same arithmetic appears in later scholarly texts that have nothing to do with kings or aliens. Lists of divine ages, planetary cycles, cosmic periods. When you view WB 444 inside that mesh of sexagesimal speculation, the long reigns look like a human scribal construction, not a misunderstood technical record from somewhere else. So there is a sharp contrast. On one side, a speculative reading that treats the numbers as literal, and the cosmology as misdescribed technology. On the other, historical, philological reading that treats the numbers as symbolic and the cosmology as part of a coherent religious worldview designed for human audiences. The question is how to evaluate claims that fall between those poles. One way is to slow down and ask a few calm questions each time a new explanation is offered. First, what exactly does the text say? Not a paraphrase, not a meme, but the actual wording on the tablet. Does WB 444 explicitly say that these kings were gods, beings from another world, or does it simply list, in Eridu, Alulim became king and ruled X years? Are the enormous reigns presented with any commentary, or are they given as bare fact in the same formula used later? Second, what translation are you looking at? Cuneiform is difficult. Small decisions about how to read damaged signs can change the sense of a passage. Serious editions usually come with transliterations, apparatus, and discussion of alternatives. Popular books sometimes smooth those away. When an extraordinary claim rests on a single phrasing, descended from the sky, from a distant planet, it's worth checking whether that wording appears in standard scholarly translations or only in highly interpretive ones. Third, what is the broader context of the motif? If someone points to kingship descending from heaven as evidence of alien arrival, you can ask, where else in Mesopotamian literature does this phrase appear? How do other texts talk about kingship? About the gods' relationship to cities, floods, and resets? When you see the same metaphor used in temples, hymns, and royal inscriptions, all within a human theological framework, the alien reading starts to look less necessary. Fourth, are the numbers unique? Do we see similar gigantic spans attached to gods, cities, or cosmic cycles in other tablets? If so, that suggests a shared numerical language rather than a one-off historical report. Base. 60 patterning in the antediluvian section is a strong clue here. Links the King List to internal Mesopotamian traditions of thinking with big, clean multiples. Fifth, claim require adding elements that are not in the cuneiform record at all. Genetic engineering, spacecraft, lost advanced technologies. These can be entertaining to imagine, but they are not concepts that any surviving Sumerian or Akkadian text mentions. When an interpretation leans heavily on modern technological ideas that have no direct anchors in the ancient vocabulary, it becomes more a work of creative fiction than of historical reading. None of this means you have to shut down curiosity. The past is strange. People who wrote WBB 444 really did believe in gods who could rearrange the world, in floods that reset time, in ages when the boundary between human and divine was more permeable. The antediluvian rains are still not fully explained, in the sense of a tidy, universally accepted theory that accounts for every detail. It is fair to say, there is something going on here that we do not completely understand. What mainstream scholarship tends to do is to look for explanations that arise from within that ancient world rather than importing frameworks from outside it. To read the King List as part of a conversation, Sumerian and Babylonian scribes were having with each other about time, authority, cosmic order, and instead of as a muffled record of conversations with visitors from another star. If you approach WB 444 that way, the long reigns remain enigmatic, but in a different register. They are not puzzles to be cracked by decoding alien chronologies. They are signposts in a landscape of ideas, crowd. Numbers that tell you where mythic prehistory ends and ordinary kingship begins. Figures that compress a hazy memory of before into something that will fit on a tablet and serve as scaffolding for later history. And yet, persistence of speculative readings tells us something important. It tells us that the King List is still doing its old job. It is still pushing readers up against scales of time and regimes of kingship that feel too large, too ordered, too strange to be purely human. Faced with that feeling, some people reach for extraterrestrials, others reach for numerology, scholars reach for base, 60, and comparative literature. All of them in different ways are responding to the same provocation, the sense that these numbers are not just exaggerations, but deliberate choices pointing beyond themselves. Whether those choices are encoding cosmic arithmetic, lost political memory, or some hybrid of both is still open to debate, to see how far that debate has actually gone inside the field, and where informed disagreement still lives. We have to look at the more cautious, but no less imaginative, arguments scholars are having with each other about WB 444's impossible kings. If you sit down with a stack of articles on the Sumerian King List, you don't just find one calm, settled explanation of those antediluvian reigns. You find several overlapping, partly compatible, competing stories that all get you part of the way there. Then stop. One cluster of explanations treats the numbers as essentially theological. In this view, the antediluvian section is a way of saying, before the flood, kingship was qualitatively different. It belonged more directly to the gods. The enormous reigns express that distance. King, who rules 36,000 years, is not just old. He is of a different order of time. This fits nicely with the way large sexagesimal units show up in other scholarly and religious texts. Gods can be given lifespans measured in sars and ners. Cosmic ages can be described in mathematically elegant spans that no human could live through. The early kings plug into that same register. They stand half in the realm of the gods, half in the realm of cities and politics. That explanation has limits. It makes sense of the difference between antediluvian and post-diluvian reigns, but not of every detail. Why 8 kings? Not 3 or 12? Why a total of 241,200 years, not some other combination of neat multiples? Why does the pattern of lengths vary slightly between manuscripts if the whole thing is a fixed theological code? Another cluster of explanations is historical mythic. Here the argument runs, the flood in Mesopotamian tradition is not just a metaphor. It crystallizes some long dim memory of real environmental crises, real displacements, real breaks in continuity. The antediluvian names could be fossilized traces of venerated ancestors, local chieftains, mythic culture, heroes, stretched over time by oral tradition and by the desire to connect the present to a very deep past. On this view, Alulim of Eridu, ruled for X years, is not a god or an alien. He might be a remembered founder, inflated until his reign stands for an entire age of that city's prehistory. Again, this helps. It explains why the antediluvian kings are still tied to specific cities. It explains why later rulers in those same cities sometimes claim ritual connections to them. It fits with what we see in other cultures, where legendary dynasties keep time across the gap between memory and archaeology. But it doesn't fully solve the numbers either. Oral tradition can stretch things. But it doesn't spontaneously decide that the best way to exaggerate is 60 times 60 times 10. That kind of arithmetic feels like something that happened in scribal schools, not at campfires. Third line of explanation focuses explicitly on that scribal world. Here the King List is read as a learned exercise in sexagesimal thinking, kind of political theology done with numbers. The idea is that scholar scribes composing and copying WB 444 and its relatives liked their big round figures. They liked to express completeness through exact sums, so they took whatever legendary material they inherited about pre-flea flood rulers and assigned reigns that would add up to a deliberate total in base 60. A cosmic cycle gets sliced into royal reigns. Each king is a segment in a grand numerically tuned timeline. This is where the base 60 analysis shines. It shows that the antediluvian block is not random exaggeration. It is architected. The individual reigns are mostly clean, decomposable units. The grand total is a perfect, almost ostentatious multiple that looks a lot like what Mesopotamian scholarly texts do when they talk about the ages of gods or the durations of world eras, but here too there are loose ends. Not every manuscript agrees on every figure. Some copies give slightly different totals. That suggests transmission, correction, and maybe experimentation. Not a single canonical code dropped from the sky, and numerical elegance tells us how the scribes were thinking, without telling us why they chose this particular architecture instead of another one that would have worked just as well. A fourth family of explanations is literary. In this view, the King List is a crafted narrative, prologue of impossible antiquity, a turning point marked by the flood, and then the slow narrowing toward ordinary time. Huge reigns are narrative devices. They expand the before into an almost timeless expanse, so that the transition to human-scale kingship feels like a major shift in the order of things. That definitely matches how the text reads. There is a distinct change of tempo when the flood arrives, and kingship descends from heaven a second time. After that, reigns get much shorter, cities change hands more frequently, dynasties rise and fall. The earlier span feels like a long, slow overture. Reading the numbers as purely literary can flatten the very thing that makes them strange. It treats them as a mood rather than as deliberate entries in a larger Mesopotamian habit of calculating divine and cosmic time. So each perspective contributes something. Theological reading marks the antediluvian section as a different order of time. Historical mythic angle roots it in some kind of remembered past. The scribal numerical view shows us the sexagesimal architecture. The literary approach highlights the way the list moves from mythic prelude to human history. None of them on its own fully accounts for the scale. Alongside that, there are much more technical disagreements that most readers never see. Cuneiform is dense. WB 444 prism is damaged in places. Some digits are missing. Some are partially preserved. Some signs can be read more than one way, especially when they are numerical notations rather than spelled out words. Philologists argue, quietly and patiently, over details like, is that sign a 6 or a 7? Does this damaged corner preserve the end of a SAR, or is it part of a different unit? Is this city name written in a variant spelling that implies a different reading of the whole line? Different choices can shift a reign by hundreds or thousands of years. They can change whether a particular total comes out as a perfect sexagesimal, multiple or not. They can alter how neat the numerical patterning looks. That means some of the arguments about how designed the antediluvian block is depend on readings that are not absolutely fixed. There are also questions of genre that complicate things. The King List does not fit cleanly into any single Mesopotamian category. It is not a myth in the way the Atrahasis or the Epic of Gilgamesh are myths, with dialogues and gods speaking. It is not a royal inscription written by one king about his own victories. It is not a simple administrative document either. It sits at a boundary, borrows its opening scenario from mythic tradition. Pre-flood cities, divine kingship, a cosmic deluge, borrows its middle and later sections from archival reality. Names, cities, dynastic successions that match what we see in independent inscriptions. It borrows its arithmetic from scholarly lists and astronomical texts, borrows its political logic from later royal propaganda, smoothing over rivals and presenting a single line of legitimate rule because of that hybrid character. Scholars are increasingly wary of any single key explanation. If you treat it entirely as theology, you underplay its use as political history. If you treat it entirely as political history, you miss the deliberate mythic framing. If you treat it entirely as numerology, you risk turning it into a crossword puzzle where every crown, every city, every flood is just a placeholder for a number. The uncertainties in translation and the uncertainties in genre feed into one central unresolved issue. What, within Mesopotamian thought, were those antediluvian numbers for? Were they primarily didactic, teaching young scribes about the structure of time and the limits of human kingship? Were they a way of harmonizing different city traditions into a single prehistory, giving each cult center a seat at the table of before the flood? Were they an attempt to anchor theological ideas about ages and eras in a pseudo-historical format that readers would find authoritative? Were they something else again? A mesh of all of these functions at once? We can see that the numbers are patterned. We can see that they were important enough to copy, recopy, adjust, and preserve for centuries. We can see that later Babylonian scholars still cared about antediluvian sages, kings, and cities, but the exact mental move a scribe made when he wrote Alulim, 28,800 years on a clay surface. The mix of awe, piety, calculation, and tradition behind that figure remains out of reach. In the middle of this kind of uncertainty, it can actually be soothing to step back, to remember that you don't have to pick one theory and defend it to the death. You can let the possibilities sit side by side for a while. You can enjoy the strangeness without resolving it immediately. And if you like spending time in that space, where the evidence is real, but the answers are not quite finished, that's exactly the feeling I've tried to capture in the book that goes with this channel. It's available at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount on it just for this week, if you happen to be listening around the time this episode comes out. However you come to it, WB 444 keeps inviting the same question. Not, what do these numbers mean to us? What did they mean to the people who wrote them? Until we can answer that more fully. The King List will keep hovering in that intriguing space between the known and the unknown. Enough is clear to rule out some of the bolder modern fantasies. Not enough is clear to collapse the mystery. That leaves us with one last task, not to solve the puzzle, but to learn how to sit with it. To look at a clay prism covered in impossible rains, accept that the people who wrote it were doing something precise and serious, and allow the unanswered part to stay alive in our minds. So let's sit with it for a moment. Imagine that prism again, or one of its cousins. 4 narrow columns per face, lines of wedges marching in order, city name, king's name. A reign length that looks like it came out of a calculator someone left running for too long. The numbers are not random. too clean, too decomposable, too neatly aligned with the sexagesimal system these scribes lived and breathed. You don't get 28,800 years by accident. You don't get totals like 241,200 years by simply making things up on the fly. At the same time, they are too large, too systematically inhuman to be read as actual reigns in any straightforward sense. No city, no court, no irrigation bureaucracy can run for 30 millennia under one continuous king. The clay itself understands that. A few columns later, the same scribes are happily listing rulers who reign 16 years, or 36, or 7 months. That tension is the heart of the puzzle, deliberate precision on one side, inherent impossibility on the other. The King List is telling us something very carefully. We're just not entirely sure which language it's speaking in. From everything we've seen, a few anchors do feel solid. WB 444 is a real object, made in a specific late Babylonian context, when scholar scribes were fascinated by old traditions. It is part of a family of king lists, some damaged, some fragmentary, some local variants trace a recognizable skeleton of Mesopotamian dynasties. The antediluvian section is always there near the front, its remote cities and towering figures. The structure of the text is stable enough to recognize. Kingship descends from heaven, cities rise and fall. The flood cuts time in two. Within that frame, the giant numbers behave like something crafted, not like static from a radio. They may be doing several jobs at once. On one level, they are mathematics. Opportunities to deploy big, elegant sexagesimal units, to practice addition and factorization, to express the beauty of multiples, and totals the way other texts express the beauty of hymns. On another level, they are symbols. A way of saying, this era is not like ours, using lengths of time as a kind of sacred vocabulary. They are also politics. A way to line early cities up in a dignified queue to give each cult centre an honourable slice of before the flood, and make later rulers look like the heirs of something unimaginably ancient, and they are tradition. Numbers that have been copied, adapted, and rejustified over generations, calcifying into authority, simply by being repeated in the right kind of clay, by the right kind of hand. Those layers don't cancel each other out, they stack. A late Babylonian scribe could copy a line that his teacher had copied from an older tablet, preserving a revered total while also appreciating its neat base, 60 structure, while also sensing that these huge spans marked off a world in which gods and kings blurred together more than they do now. The same number can be a school exercise, a theological marker, a political statement, and a piece of inherited myth, all at once. What we don't have is the inner monologue. We don't know what it felt like, cognitively, to press a stylus into damp clay and write 28,800 years. Did it register as a literal duration, shorthand for an age? As a code that only trained colleagues could really unpack? Or did those categories blur, the way they often do in ancient texts, where how long and how significant are almost the same question? That is where the mystery really lives. Not in whether the numbers hide some secret alien chronology or encoded astronomical cycle, but in the more modest, more human question of meaning, intention. Of mental worlds we can only reach at an angle. We can map the arithmetic. We can trace the manuscript tradition. We can line the list up against archaeological strata and see where it matches and where it floats free. But there is a gap between reconstructing the system and inhabiting it. To some people, that gap feels frustrating. To others, it's exactly the kind of open space the mind likes to wander in. If you find yourself in that second camp, if you like following the evidence right up to the edge of what we can say, and then just resting there for a bit, this is probably not the only clay tablet that will pull you in. There are ziggurats of unanswered questions in the ancient world. The King List is just one of the more compact ones, if you'd like more of that slow, careful evidence. First wandering through prehistoric puzzles, the book that goes with this channel is written in the same spirit. It spends a lot of pages with mysteries we can frame clearly, but not quite close. You can read more about it, or pick up a copy if you'd like, at sleepytimehistory.com. While you're here, if this way of approaching the past helps you relax, it does help the channel a lot if you gently tap like, or subscribe, or let this play again while you drift off. And I would love to hear from you in the comments, especially where you're listening from tonight or today. One of the quiet pleasures of making these is seeing how many different corners of the world end up sharing the same ancient stories. However far we push the philology and the base, the 60 math, I suspect the Sumerian King List will always keep a private corner. Impossible reigns will go on, sitting there, perfectly carved into time, reminding us that not every question about the past has to arrive at a final, tidy answer. Sometimes it's enough to know that the people who came before us were also capable of precise, patient thinking, and that some part of what they meant by it will always remain just out of reach.